In the far edge of the galaxy, there was a name that made stars fall silent. That name was the Alien Overlord. For centuries she ruled without fear. No army could defeat her. No weapon could touch her. Every world trembled when her fleet appeared in the skies. Her throne stood high above all others, built of black crystal and burning light, and her voice alone was enough to command millions. The people called her invincible. They said she could not bleed. They said she was more machine than flesh. Her eyes glowed with a cold fire. Her hands could crush steel. Even her own generals bowed low, afraid to speak too loud in her presence. Whole planets were stripped of freedom. Children grew up never knowing what hope meant. And the stars themselves seemed chained under her empire. Rebels rose many times. Brave warriors from dozens of species gathered. They tried to strike her fleets, but one by one, every rebellion was crushed. Their leaders silenced. Their armies burned to ash. No one asked anymore how to fight her. The question had died in the dust of 1,000 lost battles. Instead, the galaxy whispered only one truth. The Alien Overlord was eternal. She could not be stopped, but even in the darkest night, there are sparks that no tyrant can see. Among the broken worlds, rumors spread of a weakness. Some said she was not truly a god, that her power came from something hidden, something she guarded more than anything else. But no spy ever lived long enough to learn what it was. No soldier ever came back to tell the secret. The Overlord herself fed these fears. She stood tall in her silver armor, her crown humming with energy from another age. She declared herself immortal. She declared her rule would last forever. And when she spoke, whole populations knelt without resistance. Yet, somewhere far from her throne, a single human walked quietly across the galaxy. He was not a soldier. He was not a king. He carried no great weapon. His clothes were plain, his face forgotten in a crowd, but his eyes saw things differently. His mind listened where others only obeyed. This human had no fleet, no army, no followers. He had only himself, and a strange feeling that the Overlord was not what she seemed. The galaxy laughed at him. How could a human so fragile and weak stand against a being that had destroyed empires? They said he would vanish like dust. They said his bones would decorate her throne, but the human kept walking. Step by step, world by world, he listened to the whispers. He studied the ruins left by her fleet. He asked questions no one dared to ask. And slowly, he began to see a pattern. The Overlord's power was not random. It followed rules. It followed something like a rhythm, like lines of hidden music that only his human eyes could catch. Meanwhile, on her throne world, the Overlord sat in silence, her eyes scanning the stars. She felt the weight of her empire and the flow of endless data across her mind. She had broken 1,000 enemies before, but this time she felt something strange, a disturbance small, almost nothing, like a shadow she could not catch. Her generals told her it was nothing, just another fool somewhere in the galaxy. But the Overlord was not pleased. Her perfection had no space for shadows, and so in the heart of her shining empire, the invincible Overlord waited, unaware that a human was coming closer with every step. A human who did not fear her throne. A human who would one day break her code. For now she was still invincible, she was still eternal, and the galaxy still bowed before her name. But the stars knew a secret. Invincibility never lasts forever, and soon, even the strongest would learn what it meant to fall. The human's journey finally brought him to the edge of the Overlord's empire. Towering cities of glass and steel filled the skies. Alien ships buzzed above like hornets guarding a nest. Marketplaces roared with languages older than Earth itself, and every shadow carried the mark of her rule. In this place, humans were nothing. They were small and fragile, their bones weaker than the scaled warriors of Drath, their muscles thinner than the iron beasts of Karun, their minds considered slow compared to the thinkers of Vera. Among these giants, a human was a joke. The man walked through the crowded streets, heads turned, and laughter followed him. An alien merchant with 4 tusks jeered at him. "What storm blew you here, soft blood? Do you hope to sell your skin for a coin?" The crowd around them roared with cruel amusement, but the human did not answer. He kept his eyes low, watching, listening. Every insult became another piece of information, every laugh another reminder of how invisible he could be. To the giants of this empire, he was not a threat. He was not even a challenge, and that made him powerful in a way none of them understood. The Overlord's banners hung across every tower, her face carved into walls of stone. Her glowing eyes seemed to follow him wherever he walked. She was everywhere and nowhere. Her voice broadcast across the skies, commanding loyalty with a tone that froze hearts. Yet when the human looked at her image, He did not bow, he did not tremble, he studied. He searched for the cracks behind the mask. At night, he slept in alleys between machines twice his height. Alien beggars with steel claws shuffled past, scavenging scraps. Even they mocked him for being too weak to survive. But the humans smiled in silence. Weakness was the best disguise, and no one feared what they believed already broken. On the third day, whispers reached the Overlord's generals. A human had entered the capital. A human who carried no weapon, no papers, no name. To them it was laughable, but to the Overlord it was a curiosity. She had lived too long to ignore shadows. "Bring him before me," she ordered, her voice echoing through her palace. Soldiers came in the night, armored giants with blades longer than his body. They dragged him through glowing streets and into the heart of her empire. Every step drew the eyes of aliens who stared in disbelief. A human standing before the throne of the invincible Overlord. What madness was this? The throne room was vast. Ceilings vanishing into smoke, pillars carved with the bones of fallen kings, and at the center she sat, the Overlord herself, silver armor reflecting light like a star, her crown alive with streams of energy, her eyes burning cold. The generals laughed openly. "This is the one who walked among us, this fragile creature. He will not last a breath before her." But the human stood calm. He lifted his head and looked into the Overlord's glowing eyes. While all others bowed, he stared. Silence filled the room, broken only by the hum of machines inside her crown. "Why do you not kneel?" she asked, her voice smooth yet sharp as a blade. The human's answer was quiet, almost a whisper. "Because I see you." The words made the hall freeze. The generals frowned, not understanding, but the Overlord's eyes narrowed. She leaned forward as if something in his voice pulled her closer. For the first time in centuries, she felt a ripple of something she had not felt before. Not fear, not anger, but doubt. The generals scoffed and demanded his death. Yet the Overlord raised her hand. "Not yet," she said. "This human is different." The man was taken to the lower cells. Yet even there, surrounded by alien guards and unbreakable walls, he smiled because he had seen what no one else dared to see. He had looked into her eyes and found hesitation. Among the giants he had stood small, mocked and dismissed. But in that throne room for a single moment, he had shaken the invincible Overlord, and in his heart he knew the truth. Giants fall not by strength, but by finding the right place to strike. The human was no soldier, but he had already begun the war. A war not of weapons, but of eyes that see too deep, of words that cut sharper than blades, and of patience that outlasted even empires. The Overlord sat on her throne long after he was gone, her crown humming louder than before, her hands tightening as if the throne itself was uneasy. She had faced armies, assassins, and gods of war. Yet a single human had entered her hall and left behind a question she could not silence. Who was he? And why did his eyes make her feel less eternal? The galaxy still saw her as untouchable, invincible, eternal, but deep inside her perfect empire, a seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew in the silence of her own mind. The human sat in the cold prison cell, the walls glowing faint blue, alive with energy that no blade could cut. The guards laughed outside, saying no human had ever left this place alive. But he did not fear. He only watched every day. The Overlord's empire moved with perfect rhythm. Guards marched at the same hour. Lights shifted at the same moment. Her voice echoed across the skies with flawless timing. To others it looked like power. To him it looked like a pattern. He noticed that nothing ever changed. The markets opened and closed with exact precision. The bells rang at the same second, and even the stars above the capital followed a cycle too neat to be natural. Perfection was a mask, and masks always cracked from his cell. He began marking the walls with scratches, not random, but counting the pulses of energy that ran through the stones. He listened to the hum in the air, the vibration under the ground. Soon he realized it was not magic, it was code. The Overlord was feared as a goddess, but he saw her as something else, a being bound by a system, a living machine chained to rules, to cycles, to a hidden language. At night, when the guards changed shifts, he heard small delays, 1 second too long. One door that did not open smooth but clicked twice. Tiny errors no one else noticed, but he noticed. He began to smile in the darkness. The invincible Overlord was not flawless. She was a prisoner of her own design and only a human. Small and ignored. Could see the difference, meanwhile, in her throne room. The Overlord sat restless, her crown burning with streams of light. She replayed the moment the human had looked into her eyes. She hated the memory. Hated that his words still echoed inside her mind. "Because I see you." Her generals told her to erase him. to end the annoyance, but she refused. She told herself it was because she was curious, but deep down she knew. She was afraid of what he might know. The human, weak in body, carried a strength that could not be measured. The strength to see the cracks in perfection. One evening, a storm of plasma rolled across the capital skies. The walls trembled as lightning struck. Power surged in the prison. For one moment the lights flickered. It was only a second, but it was enough. The human pressed his hand to the wall and felt the rhythm break. He whispered to himself. So, even gods stutter. The guards mocked him for speaking to walls. But he kept listening, learning, mapping the empire not with maps or weapons, but with patterns of sound and light. In time he discovered something deeper. The Overlord's broadcasts carried more than her commands. Hidden under her words was a structure, numbers repeating, codes disguised as authority. Every time she declared her power, she also revealed her prison. No alien dared to hear it. Their ears deafened by fear, but the human listened, and he began to understand. The Overlord sensed the shift. She felt him watching even from his cell. She sent spies to test him, strange creatures with eyes like glass. They whispered lies, offered him freedom, tried to tempt him into revealing what he knew. But he only smiled and stayed silent. The cracks grew wider, not in stone, but in belief. For the first time, her guards hesitated. They saw how calm he was. They wondered what secret gave him such stillness, and whispers spread through the lower ranks. Why does the Overlord not kill him? They asked each other. Why does she keep him alive? Fear that once fed her empire began to twist into curiosity. And curiosity was dangerous. One night, the Overlord herself descended to the prison, her armor shining like a moon. The guards bowed low as she entered. She stood before the human cell, her eyes glowing sharp. You watch too much, she said, her voice cold. Do you think you see something others cannot? The human lifted his head, his face calm. I see the cracks, he whispered. Her eyes narrowed. She demanded he explain. But he only smiled, and for a single breath her heart raced, because she knew he was not lying. She left the cell in silence, her crown flickering as though disturbed. And for the first time she did not feel invincible. She felt watched. She felt fragile. The human leaned back against the wall, his hands resting calmly on his knees. He whispered into the darkness. Even the strongest cage has a key, and I will find it. Outside, the empire still glittered with the perfection of order. Ships flew in perfect lines, towers shone with flawless light. But beneath it all, cracks were spreading, unseen by all but one, and that one was human. The days inside the prison blurred into one another. Yet for the human, each hour carried meaning. He counted every flicker of light, every tremble in the stone, every hum in the air. And his mind painted a map no other creature could see. One night, as the storm outside howled against the towers, the human pressed his palm flat against the wall. This time he felt not just the rhythm, but a hidden pulse buried deep beneath it. It was faint, almost like a heartbeat, a beat that did not belong to stone or machine, but to her. His eyes opened wide. The Overlord herself was bound to this system. Her perfection, her empire, her very body were linked to the code that flowed through these walls. If that code broke, she would break with it. It was a discovery so dangerous that if the guards had known what he realized, they would have killed him without waiting for orders. The next morning, 2 guards dragged him from his cell, chains wrapped around his wrists. They led him through golden halls until he stood once again before the throne of the Overlord. Her presence filled the room like a storm, her eyes burning brighter than the torches. She leaned forward, her silver armor catching the light. You are not afraid, she said, her voice sharper than a blade. Even now, with death at your throat. The human raised his head, his voice calm. Fear blinds the eyes. I prefer to see, the general snarled, demanding his execution. But the Overlord lifted her hand. Silence fell. She studied him as though he were the first puzzle she had ever faced. Tell me, she asked, what do you see? The hall grew still, thousands of soldiers waiting for his words. But the human did not tremble. He looked straight into her eyes. I see the cage you built for yourself. A murmur swept through the chamber. The generals shouted, their voices shaking with fury. Lies, he speaks madness, destroy him. But the Overlord raised her hand once again. Her glowing crown flickered for half a second. Only she felt it. Only she noticed the tremor inside herself. The human's words struck too close to truth. She ordered him taken back to the cells. Yet her eyes followed him as he left. Her thoughts restless, her mind replaying his every word for the first time. Her perfection felt like a chain around her neck. In the darkness of the cell, the human smiled faintly. The Overlord had not killed him. That meant she feared his words more than his existence. That night, the pulse beneath the walls beat stronger. His ears caught fragments of sound, a sequence of numbers, hidden within the hum of the stones. He whispered them under his breath, testing the rhythm, and the walls trembled as though listening. The next day, the Overlord summoned him again. This time not to mock, not to frighten, but to question. She walked alone into his cell. No guards, no generals, only her and the human. "Speak," she demanded, her eyes glowing cold. "What do you know of me?" The human studied her face, the faint shimmer of her armor, the crown alive with streams of hidden code. "You are not eternal," he said softly. "You are bound like the rest of us. Only your chains shine brighter." Her hands curled into fists. The air around her crown sparked, yet her voice lowered to a whisper. "How could you know this?" The human leaned closer, his words quiet. "Because I listened. And your perfection cannot hide its own echoes." For a long moment, she said nothing, her breath steady but her heart racing. Never had anyone spoken to her this way. Never had anyone dared to strip away her illusion. She turned sharply, leaving the cell without another word. But her steps were faster, her armor heavier, her silence louder. The generals noticed her unease, and they whispered among themselves, fear turning into suspicion. They began to question if their Overlord was truly invincible. The dangerous discovery no longer belonged only to the human. It had begun to ripple outward, unseen but unstoppable. From the lowest guard to the highest general, eyes began to glance more carefully. Ears began to listen for things they once ignored. The Empire's foundation trembled not from war, but from doubt, and doubt was more dangerous than any weapon. That night, the human closed his eyes in the cell, whispering the rhythm of numbers he had learned, his lips moving like prayer. Cracks will grow, chains will weaken, even gods can fall. Above him in her throne chamber, the Overlord stood before the great mirror of obsidian, her reflection burning with power. Yet behind her own eyes she saw what he had seen, the faint shimmer of chains. And for the first time since she had taken her throne, she wondered if she was free or if she was only a prisoner wearing a crown. The prison cell was no longer a place of despair. For the human it had become a classroom. Every hum in the walls, every flicker of the lights, every strange rhythm carried a lesson. He listened, he counted, he memorized. And slowly the hidden language of the Overlord's empire unfolded before him. The discovery he made was terrifying. The Overlord's power was not endless, it was written, scripted like a song that never changed its tune. Her armies moved by the same rhythm, her ships flew by the same pulse, and her own crown glowed with the same repeating patterns. No one else dared to see it, they were blinded by fear. But the human saw clearly at night when the guards slept. He traced numbers into the dust on the floor, connecting lines, testing shapes. He whispered patterns into the dark like keys testing locks. Each night the hum of the walls answered him, trembling faintly as if the Empire itself was listening. One evening, as the storms shook the towers above, the human pressed his palm against the stone and spoke a full sequence he had pieced together. The walls vibrated, the light inside flickered. The energy dimmed for half a breath, and in that half breath the human smiled, because he knew he had begun to break the code. The Overlord felt it too, far away on her throne. Her crown flared suddenly. Streams of energy jolted through her mind. Her generals rushed to her side, demanding to know what had happened, but she only whispered, "The rhythm has changed." Her hands trembled slightly. She clenched them tight to hide the weakness. Her generals saw only power, but inside she knew something dangerous was happening. The human was brought before her again, chained but his eyes calm, his step steady. The Overlord stared down at him, her voice sharp. "What are you doing?" He lifted his head. "I am listening to you." Her jaw tightened. Sparks flashed from her crown. The general shouted for his death again, but she silenced them with a single gesture, her eyes locked on the human, fear and fury twisting inside her. That night she ordered spies to search his cell. They found numbers scratched into the stone, meaningless to them, but to her they burned like wounds. She ordered them erased. But when the human returned, he carved them again, calm, steady, unstoppable. Every attempt to silence him only fed his strength. In the lower levels of the palace, a quiet rebellion began. Not with weapons, but with whispers. Guards told each other of the human who smiled in chains. Workers repeated stories of how he stared into the Overlord's eyes without fear, Rumors spread that he had found her secret, and though no one spoke it loudly, the thought grew, if the Overlord could be broken, then perhaps she was not invincible after all. The human knew the time was near. The code was almost complete. He could see the path, the sequence that linked her crown, her empire, her very life. One night, he was taken from his cell not to the throne, but to the core chamber, the heart of her empire, a place no outsider had ever seen, a place glowing with endless streams of light, machines towering like mountains, wires pulsing like veins. At the center stood the source of her power, a sphere of fire caged in crystal, humming with the rhythm he had followed for weeks. The Overlord herself walked beside him, silent, her eyes burning cold. "You wish to see my truth," she said, her voice low. "Then see it in despair." But the human did not despair. He stepped forward, studying the sphere, his lips moving as he whispered the rhythm, matching each pulse with the numbers in his mind. The Overlord watched him closely, her chest tight with unease. Never had anyone stood before the core without trembling. Yet this fragile human stood as though he had always belonged here. He turned slowly to face her, his voice calm. "This is not your strength, it is your chain." Her eyes flared, fury flashing across her face. "Silence," she shouted, the chamber trembling, sparks bursting from the machines. But the human raised his voice, speaking the sequence aloud, the hidden language that no alien had ever heard, words that cut deeper than blades, codes that struck at the very root of her empire. The sphere shuddered, the crystal cracked faintly. Alarms rang through the chamber. The generals outside rushed in, their voices shouting in panic. But none of them understood what was happening. Only she and the human knew. The Overlord staggered, her knees bending for the first time in centuries, her crown flickering wildly, her perfection breaking. The human's voice grew louder. "You are not eternal," he said. "You are only a song, and songs can be broken." She fell to one knee, her hand pressing against the floor. Her empire shaking with her, the generals stood frozen, their invincible queen trembling before a human. And in that moment the galaxy changed. The human had broken the code. The chamber roared with alarms. Red light washed across the walls. Soldiers rushed in with weapons raised, but their eyes widened in disbelief. Their queen, the invincible Overlord, was on one knee, her crown flickering like a dying star. For centuries, she had stood as eternal, untouchable. Yet in this moment her body trembled, her armor cracked, her voice strained. And all because a single human spoke words she could not silence. The human stood tall in the center of the chamber, chains still on his wrists, his voice steady, repeating the rhythm, breaking her code with each breath. The sphere of fire pulsed violently, cracks spreading across the crystal that caged it. "Stop him!" one general shouted. But when soldiers stepped forward, the Overlord herself raised her hand weakly, her voice breaking. "No," the soldiers froze, their confusion growing. Why would she defend him? Why would she stop them? Because deep inside she knew the truth. If they killed him, the knowledge would not die. The cracks were already open, and she feared that his death would only shatter her faster. The human's eyes locked on hers, calm and steady. "You have ruled too long with fear. Your code is broken. Your chains are showing." Her chest heaved. Her hands clawed at the floor, sparks bursting from her crown. Her voice cracked with rage. "I am eternal. I am eternal." But even as she spoke, her own words betrayed her. The rhythm faltered, the sequence stumbled, the hum of the empire itself grew uneven. Every machine across the chamber flickered in panic. The generals shouted orders. The guards aimed their weapons at the human, but none fired. Their hands shook, their eyes full of doubt. For the first time they questioned if their goddess was truly divine. The human raised his voice louder, the code spilling from his lips like fire. The air trembled with each syllable. The Overlord screamed as her crown shattered in sparks, light spilling across the floor like blood. She staggered forward, her knees striking stone, her armor denting under her own weight. Her armies watched in shock, their leader no longer invincible but broken. In that moment silence filled the chamber. The hum of perfection was gone. Only the ragged sound of her breath remained. The human stepped closer, his chains dragging across the floor. He looked down at her, the queen of 1,000 worlds, now trembling like a wounded child. "You are not more than flesh and code," he whispered, "and both can fall." Her eyes, once burning with endless power, flickered weakly, fear rising where pride had lived. She tried to speak, but no words came. The generals shouted again, but their voices carried no strength. They looked at one another, fear in their eyes, for if she could fall, then none of them were safe. Their empire was no longer eternal. The Overlord collapsed to the ground, her crown completely dark, the glow gone from her eyes, the hum of her system silent. She reached out with her hand trembling, as if begging for something no one could name, and the human, instead of striking her down, simply turned away, his voice calm. "I do not need to kill you. You have already been undone." The soldiers lowered their weapons slowly, their faith crumbling. Some fell to their knees in confusion. Others dropped their blades. The empire that once moved like a perfect machine now stood frozen, broken by a whisper of truth. The Overlord tried to rise, but her strength was gone, her body shaking, her voice nothing but a whisper. "How can this be?" The human looked back at her, his eyes calm, his words final. "Because even gods have flaws, and humans see what others cannot." She collapsed fully, her silver armor clattering against the stone, the great hall echoing with the sound of her fall. The empire trembled. The fleets in orbit stuttered as their signals failed. Towers flickered in darkness. Fear spread not of her wrath but of her absence. The invincible Overlord had fallen, not to war, not to fire, but to the eyes of a single human who broke her code. And in that silence the galaxy held its breath.
The chamber was silent, the sound of the Overlord's fall echoing through the walls like the last note of a broken song. The soldiers who once bowed to her power stood frozen, their weapons trembling in their hands. No order came, no command followed. The voice they had obeyed for centuries was gone. The human stood in the center of the room, his wrists still bound by chains, yet he looked taller than all of them, his calm eyes scanning the throne, the shattered crown, and the fallen queen who had once been called eternal. Across the empire, the collapse spread like wildfire. Ships in orbit drifted without command, cities flickered in chaos, and broadcasts that once carried her voice now played only static. The illusion of perfection was gone, the rhythm broken, and with it, fear dissolved. The Overlord lay on the cold stone, her silver armor dented, her glowing eyes dimmed. For the first time she looked small, fragile, like any other being. Her lips moved faintly, whispering words only the human could hear. "How did you see me?" The human knelt beside her, his voice soft. "Because I looked where no one dared to look." Her hand trembled, reaching for him, not in anger, but in something close to surrender, perhaps even relief. She had carried the weight of her empire for so long, pretending to be invincible, but inside she had always been chained. The soldiers stared, some dropped to their knees, not to worship, but in confusion. Others threw down their weapons and fled, for if their goddess could bleed, then nothing they had believed was true. The human rose slowly, his chains clinking. He turned to the armies that surrounded him, his voice steady. "She is not your god. She is not eternal. She is only one of you." Murmurs filled the chamber. Doubt spread wider than any rebellion ever had. Doubt that no blade could kill. The generals tried to rally their men, shouting for order, but their voices cracked. None dared move against the human now, not when their queen lay broken at his feet. In the days that followed, the empire shook. Worlds that once trembled at her shadow now raised their heads. Old banners of resistance were lifted again. But this time no fleet came to burn them down. This time the chains of fear were already shattered. The Overlord was carried from her throne, not as a goddess, but as a prisoner, her crown destroyed, her systems broken. She glared at the human, but there was no fire left in her gaze, only silence. And the human, though offered the chance to lead, refused the throne. "I did not come to rule," he said simply. "I came to break the chains." Aliens of many worlds looked at him with awe. Some bowed, others wept, for in one fragile man they had seen the end of a tyrant who was thought eternal. The galaxy whispered his name, not as a conqueror, not as a king, but as the one who saw what others could not, the one who broke the code. In secret, the Overlord sat alone in her dark chamber, stripped of power, her silver armor taken away. She whispered to herself, "He saw me, he broke me, but perhaps he freed me too." For deep inside, she had always been more prisoner than queen. The human walked away from the empire, no crown on his head, no army at his back, just a quiet smile and calm steps. He left behind a galaxy that would never see humans as weak again, because one human had looked into the eyes of eternity and proved it could fall. The dawn rose across the stars, not in fire, but in freedom, and the galaxy knew a new truth. Invincibility is an illusion, but courage is real. and sometimes the smallest eyes see what the mightiest cannot. And so began the New Age, born not from fleets, not from war, but from the quiet defiance of a human who refused to kneel. A new dawn had come,